Welcome to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary, and this is the YouTube version of our podcast. To get the audio version, you can hop on over to Spotify or anywhere that you consume audio podcasts. We are going to jump into some really cool content, so stay tuned for our next guest. We look forward to connecting with you, and be sure to subscribe. And to start your author adventure, hop on over to o'learypublishing.com, where you can map out the entire process and see what writing a book would look like for you. Let's get started. Welcome to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary, and I'm so excited. I've got Andrew Pierce here with me today, who is the new author of Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery, Putting the Universe to Work for You. And he is an author that you absolutely need to hear from and follow. So perk up your ears for this episode. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, April. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And I see a brief smile for a second there. I almost caught it. So Andrew has a therapy practice here in Southwest Florida. He works with people in addiction recovery. He's also in recovery himself. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because when someone puts together a book called Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery, you have to ask yourself, how did they come up with this idea? And that's one thing that as a publisher, I'm always fascinated by, is how someone who comes to us with a book or with an idea came to the conclusion that they needed to write the book. And so, Andrew, let's talk about that today. Let's talk about you and your own path to recovery. And this is something that, I've been in therapy before. I'm also in recovery. And sometimes when I'm sitting in the chair in a therapy office, you don't hear a lot of the backstory of your therapist. So we're going to get a peek behind the curtain. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, no, I'm all over that. That's fine. Because I'm just like everybody else that comes through my office. I specialize in addiction therapy. And so my story makes it easier to relate with my clients, so.
That's great. So tell me a little bit of your trajectory in active addiction and where it took you, which you share a little bit in the book, but you can give the listeners here a peek behind that story, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. When I look back, if I didn't have the understanding that I do now about how people, how addiction works, and before they pick up that first drink or smoke that first joint, I would never have imagined that anything unusual was going on, except that I liked smoking. I think I started drinking and smoking pot when I was 13. My folks were upstanding, pillars of the community. My dad, in a small town in central Wisconsin, my dad was an attorney. My mom was sort of the community liaison to, engage socially with everybody and make sure that people knew who he was. And, seems like a pretty good deal. Looking back, I think, he was pretty busy. And I had ADD as a kid. And so one of the things that my folks always used to say was that I'm sure their parents told them that, and this was back in the day, but they said, well, children are to be seen and not heard, right? Because they didn't want people, they wanted their peace and quiet. And so, of course, a kid with ADD falls outside the realm of that spectrum. And so you can imagine that anybody with ADD, I talk about this in the book because there's a strong correlation between ADD and addiction, is going to get some pretty negative feedback along the way. And so if your folks are kind of tend to be perfectionist or judgmental, that kind of set the stage, I think, so that when I got to be 13 and had that first drink or that first hit of pot, it was a tremendous relief compared to whatever my normal background level of stress was, which was just normal to me. So I think, that type of stuff sets the stage for a lot of people there. There's always a tremendous sense of relief. I was adopted. I think that might there's with the addiction, there's always sort of a fear of abandonment thing. I was adopted as an infant, and so that can play a role, I think, in the psychology. There are actually groups out there for people that are adopted, and there's a lot of codependency among people that are adopted, because even though their parents may have been loving and given them a good shot at life, there's always this fundamental truth in their mind that their own mom didn't even want them, and so I think that can play a role in maybe played a role for me. My folks were great, like I said. I mean, and actually met my biological mom. She tracked me down when I was 18, when I was watching a Packer game at college, and
Wow.
kind of surprised me. But I ultimately came to the conclusion that she probably did the right thing by giving me up, considering her circumstances at the time.
So
but yeah, so age 13 through 17, that's when I did my partying in college, and my grades reflected it, my behavior reflected it, and got into some legal trouble at age 17 and quit. I went to treatment. They gave me a choice between going to treatment or prison for 3.5 years, and I thought about it for about a half a second, and thought, well, maybe I'll go to treatment. So
here you are, a 17-year-old in treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting because, for anyone in addiction recovery who's been around a 12-step program, let's say, for example, and has listened to speaker meetings or things, addicts come from all different types of family backgrounds, from extremely dysfunctional drug addict families to great families with, no addiction in their family. So there's not any one particular formula that produces an alcoholic, but in your case, having adoption as part of that sort of recipe of fear of abandonment, and then the perfectionism and the ADD, all of that was sort of created the perfect storm for you that exploded at 17. So now at 17, here you are in rehab. And how did that go for you then?
Well, I went through, the court told me I had to go and then follow any recommendations. And so I went through a 30-day residential stint up in Minnesota at what I call the mothership at Hazelden. At the time it was called Hazelden. But I actually, again, having terrible insight into the depth of my own problems, I got kicked out of that treatment center for conspiring with a guy from Texas to start bringing bales of pot across the border when I got out. And so they kicked me out and they were going to send me to jail. And they ended up sending me to another place across town. Thankfully, I guess they found a bed at Fairview Deaconess Treatment Center up in Minneapolis, where I went for 30 days. And they had an interesting thing, which kind of, the idea with addiction really is ultimately to convert the motivation from external. In other words, you're kind of here because you have to be, because you don't want to lose something like your freedom or your spouse or all your money, into internal motivation. And there's a lot of shame in addiction. And I remember the little exercise that kind of turned me around was we were sitting a little group of people, and I had to write down all the aspects of my life, school, family, friends, things like that. And then I had to rip it up and throw it into the middle of this circle of I guess you could say friends, other treatment goers that were my age. And I had to look at each one in the eye and ask them if they would help me pick up my life, which was interesting because what it exposed ultimately was the amount of shame and unworthiness that comes, that a person has when they go through addiction of any length. And that was really hard to do. And so it was quite an aha moment when each of them one by one said yes, and then they helped me pick up the pieces and put it back together. So, that was a real, when I realized, I guess, that I had some, that people thought I was okay, I guess, maybe. That was a turning point for me. And I stayed sober for 13 years after that.
So now 13 years is a long time to stay sober.
Mm-hmm.
One day at a time. I heard early on in my own sobriety
Mm-hmm.
that they heard a speaker meeting where someone said they got 30 years of sobriety, and they said they couldn't believe that it was, but every single day for 30 years, like there had to be some breaks in between. Because when you're new and you're trying to get 30 days, I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
even seems like a long time, much less a year, 5 years, 13 years or whatever. So here's Andrew at year 13 in sobriety. So at that point you were what, 30?
Yeah, my 30th birthday, I gave myself
Oh,
permission to have a nice glass of wine because it sounded so
okay.
civilized. Doesn't that sound civilized?
That sounds very civilized. It sounds like you should reward yourself for 13 years of sobriety with a
Yeah,
glass of wine.
with a drink, right?
So how did that go for you?
Well, then I had an 18-year run of alcohol and substance use and other things that caused me to, lose my business, my family, pretty much everything. But I think it's worth rewinding a little bit, because during that, addiction is kind of like whack-a-mole, right? There's drugs and alcohol, sure, but there are other ways to be addicted. For instance, when I quit 7 years ago, all my addictions, I gained 75 pounds, right? So my addictions didn't really go away. They just shifted to Culver's, custard, and pizza, right? So, but during that 13-year period, and this is, again, quite a long time ago, that I was sober. I remember, yes, I was sober, but during that time, I was living in LA doing the big hair rock and roll thing, playing on the Sunset Strip. And my girlfriend at the time got pregnant. And so I've decided to do the right thing and go to college, and dropped that career. And my dad said, "Oh, when are you getting married?" and so I did, but that ties into that people pleasing type of stuff that we have that comes with low self-esteem. The byproduct always being resentment, of course. But what happened was, because that was my addiction, I think I probably had about 25 affairs during that 13 years on the gal that I married, my ex, because I developed a relationship addiction. Codependency is sort of an intrigue type of addiction. So it really never went away, but I didn't have the understanding about how addiction migrates from one thing to the next. And I just thought I was a sociopath, that I was an evil person, that I didn't care. But in retrospect, it was all motivated by the very same addictive things that motivate people with substance issues.
It's so interesting too, to understand addiction from a sober perspective, and to be able to look backwards and put some pieces together that when you're in it, you don't really see, can't understand. And a lot of shame that sort of revolves around those behaviors because there's no understanding. Mm-hmm. And then when you come through it, and now you have this understanding, like, oh, I wasn't just a sociopath or a bad person. I was just, as you said, playing whack-a-mole. And so I whacked this addiction, and then this relationship addiction popped up, or I whacked that, and then the food addiction popped up. And so we're constantly trying to smash down and get all the things down at the same time. Mm-hmm. But some of that, which tying in with your book, relies on some sort of connection with a higher power. And mm-hmm. that's why in the 12-step world, if you, as a listener, have ever embarked on a recovery journey of your own, or you have a friend or a family member who's gone into any sort of a 12-step recovery, there's a large component of that has this language around a higher power of your understanding. Mm-hmm. It doesn't term it in the sense of this is the one God you have to believe in, or the one religious text we follow, or convert and be this. It gives a wide path. Mm-hmm. But even still, a lot of people have trouble with that wording and that sort of anchor that we need as a way to combat this whack-a-mole process. And so now, after your 18-year run in which you experienced a lot of consequences and
Mm-hmm.
found out that sobriety was probably the better choice for you.
Mm-hmm.
How did you finally number one, come back into recovery? What was that moment of clarity for you? And then secondly, what was sort of the struggle of this higher power concept?
Okay. Well, let me answer the second question first, because I think that's easier. During the time that I was sober, and even into the time, I think in the 90s, it must have been, there was a movement. I figured, I felt, again, going back, that my behavior was atrocious. I couldn't guarantee my behavior, basically, was the bottom line. And so that's a terrible place to be. And so that was right about the time this Promise Keepers movement came around in the 90s.
I remember Promise Keepers. Yeah.
It was sort of a men's movement, and it was kind of neat, actually, because it was about men being accountable for their behaviors and so on. I suspect that most of them didn't probably have addictions, probably the same percentage that did. But what was frustrating for me is I'd sit around and these guys would talk about how they overcame their behavioral issues, could be relating to like women or what have you. And it just increased my shame. And so I remember going to one of those stadium things and the Million Man March, right? And sort of committing myself to the conventional Western higher power Christian God, and figured, okay, that'll fix it. And even though I didn't know what it was, I just thought I was a bad person. Well, it didn't. And so I think that's where I started developing a sense of hopelessness and contempt, right? And then I started getting rather mocking, I think, about that whole, pretty much any organized religion. And there's plenty of people that you can latch on to that will criticize religion and spirituality, and that's fine. And I certainly did, because it suited my purposes. I couldn't change my behavior, which was leading up to, you asked about the, how did I get sober this time and kind of get this figured out. About 7 years ago, I had been, I jumped in with both feet over the last 18 years. During which time then I lost my family, my business. I had a corporate retirement plan consulting firm with millions of dollars under management. I was shaken and baking. I was on the road a lot, and this was during the time that I'd started drinking. So I had time on my hands, money in my pocket, and eventually it just, as a pie chart, drinking and took over more and more and more of my life. I was still, when I was on the road, I was having a good time in a lot of different ways. And eventually went through a divorce in 2004. My daughter at that time, I let one of the affairs out of the bag because I was running out of money. I could see that there was the train that I was on, but I still, again, didn't understand anything except that I was not a good person. So I let one of the affairs public so that my wife would have an easy way to say, well, yeah, he's just an ass, and she wouldn't have to go into any great detail. Well, my daughter didn't take that well. She was 15 and my son was 3 years younger. And so she hasn't spoken to me since then. So it's been about 16 years. My daughter hasn't. So it had I felt like I was doing something benevolent, right? By leaving them a life raft, which was pretty substantial, get them through college, the house. And I just was homeless for a little while. Still drinking, moved out to LA. By the end, I was drinking 2 bottles of rum a day, doing tons of coke, and had a pot card, living the rock star life. Kind of, I had a regular job, but it didn't pay very much. I had gotten remarried, believe it or not. Yeah, I know. And anyway, on my wife's birthday, the wheels fell off because I'd been dating somebody else, and I think I added Xanax to the mix of my normal thing. And my wife was always working; she worked at the studios, and so she didn't really notice, and I had lots of time on my hands after work, and I made good use of it. Eventually I came home one night and on her birthday and kind of let the cat out of the bag. And the next morning I got a call that said, we've got to place it, but it's in the book. It's a little more colorful than that. But long story short, I ended up in Betty Ford Center out in the desert. And again, I was externally motivated because my folks had some money and I didn't want to be cut out of the will. And of course, the best way to kill somebody with a healthy addiction is to give them a bunch of money when you die. So my goal was to get sober, convince them that I'm okay, and then wait for them to die and get some money and go back to my old ways. But my therapist, who is a smart guy, Mike Potter, after a couple of weeks, and I started developing the understanding that I could stop, using and drinking. And the technology had come a lot further too, as far as understanding behavioral addictions and stuff like that. He said, Andrew, what could you accomplish if you knew you could get out of your own way? And I thought that was a fascinating question because I started to believe that I could do stuff and that I could guarantee my behavior. And that's when I became internally motivated to say, well, I'm only 48. I got a few years left. Maybe let's see what I can do. And that was the moment where things clicked.
Mm. So, and how far? And that was when you were in Betty Ford?
Yeah.
And so, here's the interesting thing is that, here goes somebody who's been on an 18-year run mm-hmm. and has this almost, like you said, things clicked. Mm-hmm. And now here's what I think is interesting is that to me, the click is a gift from the higher power. It's the thing that we can't achieve on our own. Why is it that in that very moment you had that shift in consciousness? Mm-hmm. But then if we don't acknowledge it as such, we can become skeptic.
Yeah.
We can remain in our skepticism and think that, it's my, as long as I force my will and I mm-hmm. set my goals and I am the master of my own ship, mm-hmm. I think that can also become an addiction to our own, abilities to accomplish anything and cut God out of the mix. And so
I think it's the opposite actually, because when we finally decide what we truly want, I think what we're doing is we're acting in a manner that is aligned with what our higher power wants. Right. People always say, well, it's scary to turn my will and my life over to the care of a higher power. But my perspective is that if we figure out, and this is what we do in therapy, because most people, frankly, have forgotten what they truly want. And if you don't even know who you are anymore because you've been a people pleaser for so long. I remember once saying that when I die, everyone else's life's going to flash before my eyes. Because I literally made all of my major decisions through life in order to maintain attachment with people in a codependent way out of fear mm-hmm. of abandonment. Mm-hmm. And so my skepticism, though, came from, there are a lot of valid reasons why I became skeptical. The Promise Keepers thing didn't help much because if there was a God, then it would have changed my behaviors. If I was worthy of that, right? And when that didn't happen, then it just made me feel worse because clearly I wasn't worthy of, being fixed. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, the way that I frame that, of course, is that I had to learn some difficult lessons about the depths of addiction so that I would get internal motivation to make a change, because nobody can really impose that kind of motivation externally without either destroying the relationship or creating a huge amount of resentment. But so I got sober, and I would go to meetings and I would look at the promises, and I would see there would be people at meetings that would talk about their higher power, and they always seemed to have a better depth of recovery than I had, because I was cynical and skeptical, and I didn't really make fun of them because I understand that people's belief system serve a purpose. But what happened was in the course of doing my practice here, and when I first started, I had ran an intensive outpatient program, and I was watching a documentary called Finding Joe, which was interesting. It's about basically, it was an Eastern philosophy. It presented an Eastern philosophy of spirituality, which kind of I was able to grasp onto that, and a lot of the principles of it were aligned with recovery concepts. The idea that your higher power can and do for you what you can't do yourself, do for what we don't do for ourselves. And that seemed fascinating to me because it also, I like that because I could, people that were well versed in that seemed to be able to develop a sense of spirituality. And my desire, I guess, for that depth of recovery, because I knew that I wouldn't probably be able to have a great quality of recovery unless I developed some form of a spirituality that I could live with and buy into. It just wasn't the same. And so I went about this quest of trying to find a way into spirituality that wouldn't, it would be easy for an egomaniac with this much self-esteem to accept and embrace. And I tried experientially some of the practices, some of the meditative stuff to develop a sense of that I'm not my thoughts, right? That I'm separate from my thoughts, which leads to sort of the conclusion that maybe there is some sort of like our consciousness is like the ghost in the machine, if you will, that we're just a bunch of atoms, but there's something that animates us, that makes you, you, that makes me. And intuitively it made sense. And then I started looking into some of the science behind that stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, I could see how this is possible. And I put together basically the puzzle of how that would work plausibly with hard science, which I don't have to have a lot of faith in hard science because there it is. It's proven stuff. And it made the gap, it made it that much easier to grasp a sense of spirituality and into my life from the very farthest edges of human understanding of how the world works, how reality works. It isn't that much of a leap anymore to come to the conclusion that there's some sort of higher power, divine intelligence behind this. It doesn't matter which one it is. That's one of the beauties, I guess, of the book and the clinical model that I came up with is that you can insert any God here, right? You know, Christian God, Allah, the universe, you name it. And this clinical model basically just would go about explaining how God works, how higher power works, how spirituality works, human connection, authenticity, and how important it is, and that we can leverage the universe, the nature of reality to have God or our higher power do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And when I started doing that, it got a little spooky because all sorts of good things happen. It's kind of weirded me.
It's like finding they talk about the golden key, but it's finding that sense of a higher power that unlocks all these amazing gifts, like you said, that we'll do for us what we can't do for ourselves. So I know we've sort of gone around the block here, and to kind of tie things together back on a personal level, how would you say that, your quest for spiritual understanding through, quantum theory and all of the things you present in the book, which, if you have any interest in spirituality and recovery, and you're listening to this right now, this book is a must read. I'll tell you, because not only has Andrew put so much research and dedication into the book, but there is a whole arsenal of videos and complementary digital materials that he's provided to help you understand spirituality in a way you may have never thought about it before. And so we all kind of come to the table in life with maybe the brand of spirituality that our parents raised us with, or we had sort of that Promise Keepers experience that left us disappointed, or, we had in some way this spiritual bubble was burst. And then we have to reinvent that. And so now that you're 7 years into recovery, you've written this book, you work with people in addiction recovery. How would you say that spirituality for you has really improved your quality of recovery personally?
No, that's a great question. I think that first of all, the reason I started the book was because I could see that there was a clinical value, frankly, in adopting a spiritual perspective. But for those of us who tend to be skeptical or cynical about it, or atheistic or what have you, that's fine. But I knew that with my clients, seeing them struggle with, in the absence of any sort of spiritual beliefs, it would make a lot more sense if I could adopt those. And what the value that it has, I guess the clinical value that has helped with me with relapse prevention in adopting a spiritual perspective is, if you think about the fact that addiction is ultimately a stress reaction, right? It's not the core problem. The question isn't why the addiction, it's why the pain that we're experiencing, or the uncomfortable emotions. A lot of people are worried about uncertainty, about the future. They get anxiety about that because they come from backgrounds where uncertainty was never worked out well. Let's put it that way. But the sense that when I engage in the process of, I guess, capitalizing on what I call my dual citizenship between environment, here you and I talking and I got to pay the bills, do this, that, and the other thing. That's our material world. And then there's our consciousness, our spiritual world, which within our consciousness, we have access to it's like a sanctuary almost, right? And so as somebody who's who would be vulnerable to the desire to self-medicate if things get too stressful, it's nice to have that sanctuary to go to, emotional, mental sanctuary that I can go to if I want to, and to be able to consult with that. It's also gives me a sense that once I've decided who I am and what I truly want, which I call the authentication process, I'm no longer a moving target as far as being a chameleon, one person for here, one person for there. For this situation, I'm just one person, I'm me. And people, it makes me a safer person to love, right? Because I am who I am. I'm not anybody else. And for so many people in addiction with shame, we try to present multiple images to maintain attachment with people. And because we're afraid that if we're just ourselves, right, that will be rejected, which will simply reaffirm what we unconsciously believe to be true about ourselves, which is that we're not worthy of love. And like Mark Twain said, it's better to be quiet and thought a fool than to open our mouth and be proven one, right? And so the assumption is it's the same thing with shame. It's better we always think it's better to hide and be thought unlovable than to actually assert our authenticity and have that proven to us. And so if we have this sense that a higher power can bring to the table that we are lovable, right, that we're part of that whole realm, that gives us gives me a lot more courage to be authentic in this world and have experiences that actually disconfirm those preconceptions. When I get a text or somebody that someone's looking at my book, right? I mean, in a sense, this book is like an autobiography. This is me, right? This is everything I know, up until that date. And so when somebody buys it in Australia that I've never met, or I get, reviews online, I mean, I take it very personally in a positive sense, but I also am smart enough now to know that I don't have to hit if somebody has something critical to say, which I haven't heard yet, but they're probably just not talking about it. But that I'm not going to take that personally. So the skill that we have a choice as to whether to believe things, attach my emotional wagon to thoughts and experiences that are not affirming. That was a revelation to me that came as part of a spiritual awakening, that I don't have to own every negative perceived slight or criticism. So, and then finally, the idea that everything is as it should be. I used to think that, circumstances that were distressful were, I would, this is the end of the world. I would catastrophize what was going to happen But then when I look back in the book, I talk about this, at every so-called awful experience at the time, number one, 3 to 6 months later, I've never not said it was the best thing that ever happened, right? And so it's the universe doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. It's not maybe like a positive thing, like, oh, look, there's a new car out front, but it's also detaching us from situations that maybe because of my pathology and fear of abandonment or lack of self-confidence, shame, low self-esteem, all those things that come with addiction, that's the universe removing us from situations. And I've never not been put into a better situation where, had I not gone through that negative experience, I was not put, as long as I'm breathing, I always end up in a better spot. Same thing with all of my clients. And that's valuable because from a clinical perspective, now when I look at, if I'm going through a hard time in real life, in real time, why do I want to get upset now and then wait 3 months to feel like it was the best thing that ever happened? I can know it right now. It's the best thing that's ever happening to me. I just don't know what the outcome is.
Right. I love
that. So
having
that faith, if you will, that after experience after experience after experience, that's how I build faith in my conception of a higher power.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And, it's a great way to sort of tie this up is that, when you have this connection to higher power and that based on past experiences and things happening that, saying God is doing for you what you cannot do for yourself, that in the midst of what would have normally caused the stress response, which would have made us turn to our addiction of choice, now when we get into that stress response space, we can remove ourselves. And one thing that I like to think about is having an element of curiosity, like, this is interesting. I wonder how this is going to turn out. Because I can't quite figure out how this is going to be good, but I'm sure it will in the long run. But I don't have to get my undies in a bunch today because I know that there's a reason why there are no accidents. And so that, I believe, is what brings forth what you're presenting in the book, this higher quality of sobriety, because we don't have to run back to our addictions and our, stress responses of the past, because we have the sanctuary to go to, as you're saying, based on not just woo-woo, think of, whatever conception.
Act as if, right?
Yeah, it's that there are some concrete evidence, which Andrew presents in the book, that make spirituality and the concept of a higher power, and I love your phrase, I'm going to steal it right now, a foregone conclusion. I've heard you say that many times. Mm-hmm. So spirituality doesn't have to be this act as if, pretend, it can be something that is a concrete working part of your consciousness. And so this book is revolutionary. I can say that as someone in recovery, but also as a publisher who works with a lot of different authors. Resolving Spiritual Skepticism in Recovery, I think, should be on everyone's shelf. Even if they're not in recovery, can help you really improve your own conscious connection to the universe, put the universe to work for you. And the fact that you, Andrew, were able to really be a vehicle for the universe to bring this message through, and put it together is something that I'm just grateful that we had the chance to work with you on it. So thank you for being one of our authors here. We value you.
It's a privilege. And, that was another sort of an aha moment, right? When we ended up working together.
That is the truth. The universe puts us where we need to be and with the people we need to be on the journey with. So thank you to those of you who joined us today on the podcast. We appreciate you being here. Go to Andrew's website. Where's the best way for them to get an autographed copy?
If they go to andrewgpierce.com, andrewgpierce.com, you can follow the links to projects, and that'll take you to the books, and you can order one, and we're fulfilling those requests all the time. It's great.
It's great. And Andrew will sign it for you. And on the website is also where you can opt in and get all those digital resources I mentioned earlier in the podcast. As you go through this book, you'll see various icons that are going to direct you to that digital toolkit that's going to really make this book interactive for you. So thank you, Andrew, for your time today.
Thanks,
Thank you for the gift that you have brought into the world. We so appreciate it. And his link to the book and to our website, o'learypublishing.com, are going to be in the show notes. So we hope that you will engage there. And we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast. Have a great day, all of you. Thank you. Bye now. So this has been another episode of the iBook Podcast. I'm April O'Leary signing off. Be sure to hop on over to o'learypublishing.com to start your author adventure and see what writing a book could do for you in your profession, in your career, and what doors it might open. We thank our guests for being a part of the show today, and be sure to subscribe to podcasts here on YouTube. We look forward to serving you and helping you get your book out into the world.